Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video, we're going to talk about Machinist. You see, for a while now, the player base has had a number of criticisms, I'll say, about the job, and it just seems like we're getting nowhere fast. So I decided to take things into my own hand and craft some solutions to the job's current design flaws. A light rework, if you want to call it that. I simply wanted to share this with you in the video, so that's what I'm doing. Here we go. So first off, we need to set some ground rules about how I went about this. First, I'm not remaking Heavensward Machinist. Listen, I really liked it too, and I realized while I was initially doing this that I wanted a lot of those ideas back. But I think that whatever I do here, it needs to operate within the modern job design philosophy. As such, while this is my semi-rework kind of thing, I did try to keep my changes within the bounds of the qualities that the dev team currently strives for in their job design. This absolutely means that some of you will groan at the thought of some of these changes, and quite frankly, again, these aren't the directions I would go if I had complete freedom for the job. But this isn't my fantasy job rework, so it's more of a logical interpretation. Trust me, if it was the fantasy idea, dude, we'd be getting in the G-Warrior for our 2-minute window, I can tell you that. And second, the rework needs to specifically tackle mechanical issues with the job, so I'm not going to be going much into potency here. That being said, some of my fundamental changes are made to make balancing easier or to bring it in line with other job designs. So for my rework, there were 3 core identities I wanted to maintain. The first was fast-paced gunplay. While hypercharge windows are a pain point in the current job's design, I do really enjoy the idea of rapid-firing guns and your globals and your off-globals and all that stuff. So I wanted at least a portion of the job to still somewhat feel that way without adding in a ton of new skills. So you'll see what I mean when we get to that in a little bit, but don't worry, it's also going to be addressing the core problems, which we'll touch upon in a second. Second core identity is the gadgets and tools. The job has a ton of very interesting things at its disposal, and I feel like a lot of them go to waste because the job design is just so divided between what you want to do in any given situation. So I want to bring a lot more gadgets and tools up to the modern design, which does mean simplifying them a little bit, but at the very least they won't feel like useless or unsatisfying, and that's what I want to tackle about certain gadgets and tools. And finally, Big Robot. I still like Big Robot. I'd like Bigger Robot, but I just need to do a small update to the current Big Robot, and maybe in the future we get Bigger Robot. Now, while those core identities are good and fun in Big Robot, they also need to address core problems that the job has now. And remember, we're not talking strictly about potency, we're talking about mechanical flaws with the job's design. For me, first and foremost, it's got to be hypercharge windows. Having this discrepancy between a low ping machinist and a high ping machinist is just unsatisfying. Everyone just says, oh, if you have high ping, there's rotations you can learn, but honestly, probably just play something else. And even though the devs say they test hypercharge on a 150 ms delay simulation to, I guess, say that it is okay the way that it is now, I just don't agree. It just doesn't work out that way. So I want to tackle that first and foremost, and I think I have a way, but that's only one skill, so we have other things that we really need to fix on this job. The next one for me is probably the biggest one, and it's the discrepancy between the single target and AoE gameplay. For some reason, Machinist just has aspects about it where these two things don't interact in any way, and we've seen them really try to fix this with pretty much every other job in the game at this point. Even though you have different buttons and they may be optimized differently, they still kind of lead into your burst window. Monk, of course, with perfect balance. You have a single target way of achieving your nadis, and you have an AoE way of doing it. With Red Mage, they pretty much worked their entire melee string into single target and AoE, with the difference being what your melee skill will actually be in that. And it's just, I could go on and on, but I think you get the point. Machinist just doesn't have any of that harmony, and as such, a lot of its AoE tools don't feel good to use, and they of course do not lead you to Big Robot, and I like Big Robot, so I want to fix this. And the final core problem is the job's actual identity within the ranged physical role. Currently, it is identified as the quote pure DPS option, where you have basically no utility other than the standard phys ranged utility, and you just pump damage and you worry about yourself. You will benefit from other people's buffs, but you don't offer anything else to the team. Now, this is not inherently an undoable thing. Samurai and Black Mage operate just fine within their roles. It took them a really long time to get those right. Samurai was shunned for a while, Black Mage was shunned for a while, but you see a better balance of those jobs being accepted into endgame content. Whereas Machinist still kind of gets a stink eye, and I want to address that. But we have two ways of doing that. The first is to double down on buffing their potencies and actually make them a pure DPS. And that's going to mean they have to be the highest performing job within the role, because there is the greatest discrepancy between a Fizz ranged with utility and a Fizz ranged without. Machinist without any utility doesn't have Nature's Min of Bard, it doesn't have Battle Voice, it doesn't have Radiant Finale, it doesn't have the technical finish of Dancer, the Devilman, or the standard step buff on somebody, it doesn't have the improv finish, it doesn't have the Curing Waltz. It literally has none of those things. So making it even remotely close to those other jobs just gives it a negative stigma. So it's got to perform kind of how Black Mage comparatively performs, on average at least, to Summoner and Red Mage. It needs to be just that bit higher, even after factoring in the raid buffs and how much they actually provide to the team. While I would actually kind of prefer that approach, that's not the approach I'm going to take, because option number 2 is to give them utilities and accept that that's just the way the ranged physical role is. I think the former is doable, but at this point, just give Machinist some utility. I just think the overall utility curve is too high within the role, given that Dancer and Bard offer at minimum 1 defensive and offensive utility each, and in some cases even more than that. So I am going to be incorporating some utilities into Machinist, and I'm between a few things about what to do, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Alright, so first let's at least cover the things that I don't think need to change much at all. The basic 1-2-3 combo, I don't see any reason to really change this. Again, we're not trying to go back to Heaven's Ward Machinist, so we're not trying to add that ammo system back in and everything. It's nice to have a base combo to fall back on, and it helps tremendously with the basic gameplay loop for newer or less experienced players, not to mention just it's the thing to do between your burst windows. So I think we can leave those alone. Second is reassemble. This one was actually kind of tough because I'm not a fan of the automatic critical direct hit buff thing that we're doing now. I just don't think it's healthy for the game. Please see my video on the 2-minute buff windows to get all the information about that. But if they insist on keeping it in the game, I think reassemble just stays as is. If they remove it, maybe you rework this to have some other interaction with the job, or maybe you remove it overall. But for now, we're just going to leave it as is. Oh, also the basic AoE combo, you don't need to change the 2 skills, but Scattergun needs to give 10 battery, because I want the robot to be a part of both single target and AoE, and I'll get to that a bit later. One that might surprise you is I want to keep Ricochet and Gauss Round the same. Well, for the most part, but we'll touch upon that when we talk about the skills that they're involved with. So we could consider making these 2 different buttons that share a cooldown, you know, and that way you have a single target option, an AoE option. But I think that the rapid off global cooldown gameplay is quite fun. It's just the weaving that's the problem. So I'm going to keep them as off globals, keep them separated, and we're going to tackle that issue a different way. Tactician, I think this goes without saying. So long as Bard and Dancer have their damage reduction buffs, then of course, you know, Machinist needs to keep theirs. And finally, Drill, Air Anchor, and Chainsaw. These 3 specific tools, you can leave them largely as is, you know, adjust the potencies, maybe even adjust the cooldown based on some of the changes that we're going to be making elsewhere. But other than these few things that I've mentioned, I think we can make at least some adjustments to almost everything else. So because we left off with the tools, Drill, Air Anchor, and Chainsaw, I think when it comes to changing existing skills, we should start with Bioblaster and Flamethrower, 2 very not satisfying skills. So first of all, Bioblaster. It does not feel good to reassemble. In fact, reassembling an AoE does not feel good on Machinist overall, unless it's Chainsaw, but that's the only skill it feels good with. So for Bioblaster, just cause all the damage to be front-loaded if you're reassembled, as well as perform a critical direct hit. Of course, it's reassembled. Change the animation to a point-blank poison blast or something instead of a spraying animation. That way, when you reassemble it, at least it still kind of makes sense. Then you've got Flamethrower, which I think we need to make some pretty significant changes to. Right now, the most clever thing you can do with it is to try to channel it when a boss is untargetable and then try to get 1 tick of damage before instantly doing your GCD, or you just use it in big AoE packs. So I want to change that for sure. First of all, make it a shared cooldown with Air Anchor and make it instantly provide 20 battery. Again, we're trying to bring battery into the AoE rotation because we want the Queen to also be AoEing. So I think it also needs to provide some sort of benefit for keeping the channel going specifically. The biggest problem with it is that you don't generate any heat. You're not working towards any more battery gauge when you're sitting there channeling it. And I think there needs to be some bonus for committing to a full channel, which you won't do very often, but at the very least, if it's ever optimal to do that, it doesn't set you behind in other ways in your rotation. So I think that every few seconds, depending on how they want to balance it, you get a heating up buff. And for every 1 stack of heating up, your next weapon skill will generate additional heat and potentially additional battery, maybe if you get all the way to like 3 stacks, which would essentially be channeling the whole skill. How much you get from those, I guess it depends on the balance of the rest of the job. The initial 20 battery is there just because Air Anchor gets it, but this really does depend on how frequently you're making it tick. If you make it exactly 2.5 seconds, then you could probably just do 5 heat per stack and then 10 battery gauge, and that's close enough to balance. However, if you're going to do 3 seconds, which is the usual server tick rate, then you might need to do a little bit more, like maybe 20 additional heat, but maybe still 10 battery. You don't want to do a divisible of 5, and I don't think you want to do 20 either. So I think that just makes the most sense, but it needs to have that sort of catch-up mechanic for right after you finish the long channel, in order to make sure that you're not falling behind elsewhere in your rotation. Also, I think if you reassemble it, make it do all the damage up front and critically direct hit. At that point, it doesn't even need the heating up, so that doesn't need to be a part of the reassembled flamethrower. Maybe they would want to throw it in just as a little bonus. You get 1 stack of it, but I think that's unnecessary given the point of heating up. However, I think if you're going to make this change, you also need to make Flamethrower require a target. It then becomes a potential downtime tool, which becomes really weird to optimize since it shares a cooldown with Air Anchor in this particular setting. That could lead to some pretty nasty things. It could lead to some really bad suboptimal use by players who are less experienced just because they think they're being clever. So I think you don't want it to be a downtime tool. Maybe some people would be upset that they could potentially be losing 100 potency on a target that becomes available and that whole thing I mentioned earlier, but I think it's worth the trade-off. Okay, so we took some lame AoE skills and made them a little bit more in line with the way the job's currently designed and other jobs are designed. Okay, but we haven't tackled probably the biggest issue, and that is hypercharge. So I am taking a very different approach. I had a lot of ways of going through hypercharge and trying to make it better, including the idea of just outright removing it and replacing it with another job mechanic. I could do that. I considered it. I wrote up something you could do instead of it, but I'm not going to present that. Instead, I am going to encapsulate something that I really enjoy as an alternative. Hypercharge, I think, still consume 50 heat. I think we keep heat and battery exactly the same and make it so it's still familiar to what it is now. But upon activating Hypercharge, provide the Machinist 5 stacks of the Wild Draw buff. Now, this is probably the most common thing people ask for. Just make Hypercharge stacks. That way, even if you have high ping, even if you clip, at least you don't lose entire uses of Heat Blast, which can also screw up your wildfire windows. However, I want to take a somewhat different approach from even that, because I think we can achieve removing weaving altogether from this and still making it a super fast-paced mechanic. So with the Wild Draw buff, it changes your 1-2-3 combo, your basic single target combo, to Heat Blast, and it changes your AoE combo to Auto Crossbow. Quite frankly, I don't like having those on separate buttons. They just, especially Auto Crossbow, they're just not as satisfying. I don't think it needs to be. This is more in line with what they're currently doing design-wise. I also want to set the global cooldown of these skills to 1 second. Yeah, it can't weave with only 1 second, so we don't have to worry about that at all. And I still want them to reduce the cooldowns of Gauss Round and Ricochet, but only the ones relative to which skill you're using. So if you're using Heat Blast, it reduces Gauss Round, and if you're using Auto Crossbow, it reduces Ricochet. You also just can't even activate Gauss Round or Ricochet during Wild Draw, so again, it just completely removes that possibility. Now, of course, I know what you're thinking. If you fire 5 shots off in 5 seconds, unless you were at 0 with like none of the cooldown, you're going to overcap. And yes, so we're going to tackle that problem in a different way. Upon Wild Draw ending, the Machinist is given 1 stack of Ether Round. This causes the next Gauss Round or Ricochet to only reduce the charge's cooldown by half and increase the potency by a small amount. basically, as long as you are not sitting at like 2 stacks of each when you actually go into this, you'll come out with A, full stacks, and B, you won't have as long of a cooldown tick on that first stack. Of course, give it a little bit more potency as well. It's not an exact science about how much your cooldown is going to clip, so Ether Round may make up for more or less of the cooldown that you wasted over capping there. So just give it a little bit of potency on top of that just to make sure everything is equalized. I also was very, very divided on whether or not I should even separate Gauss Round and Ricochet like this. I think if I'm going to do this, then you need to buff the potency of, if not one or both of them, then something else in the kit. It's just a matter of whether or not you want to place more power in Gauss Round and Ricochet, or if you want them to be just part of the fast shooting fantasy, which you'll still get as soon as you go back to your regular GCDs and you can go back to weaving these, then you're fine. You don't have to worry about as much. But this is what I landed on. There are still some changes I could make to it, but I love the idea of just bam, 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 just firing off those 5 shots and then instantly going into like a double weave right after that, after one of your tools, and then potentially going into just bam, bam, bam. I don't know. To me, that's really satisfying. I love the fast draw, quick draw. Maybe name it quick draw instead of wild draw, but you know, either way, you get the point of what I'm saying. A big thing is, I think you should still be able to activate other tools while draw or quick draw. I'll just rename it to quick draw in the middle of the video. There you go. I think it's still important to be able to activate the other tools while you're in the middle of quick draw, because it now lasts a period of time and also gives you stacks. If you need to interrupt it because you've screwed up and you want to make sure that your tools don't drift or whatever, then you have the freedom to do so. I think that that's a good thing to have. But of course, it needs to go back to incurring that 2.5 second base global cooldown until you start actually using Heat Blast again, which will then go back to incurring the 1 second global cooldown. So just a little safety net in case you make a mistake and activate this at the wrong time. Now, Hypercharge, one of the things you needed to tackle. However, the other one is Wildfire, which is currently a bit of a pain point. It's also not a very satisfying skill, so I think we just have a couple of simple changes to it. Make it last 15 seconds and automatically explode when it takes 6 weapon skills worth of damage. I think in terms of the functional change, everybody kind of wants this, and PvP has a version that's kind of like this. It barely gives you enough time to do all the GCDs that you need in order to do it, but you know, it still explodes automatically upon hitting a certain amount. And in PvE, I think it's worth just giving it those few extra seconds, just in case someone screws up and they still are able to get the full Wildfire benefit. A big thing though, and this is almost more important than that functional change, this skill needs to be more exciting when it goes off in any number of ways. I don't know if that means making it automatically critically direct hit. I don't know if that just means making it so that it's possible to critically direct hit, or even just making the number bigger. Like maybe it's just a big number, like it just pops on the screen and it's just far more satisfying. Give it a crazy font or something like that. I don't know. It needs to feel cooler to use. And again, I hate to say it, reverting back to Heavensward, we had some really cool wildfires with the way it worked back in Heavensward. But, you know, and I think even it worked that way in Stormblood, but it's been so long I don't really remember. I just remember Heavensward and Machinist. But if we can't do that, we can't do the massive damage variance that is old Wildfire, then it just needs to be exciting to look at. Part of making it more exciting, by the way, make it do AoE. It does it in PvP, make it do it in PvE. Again, unifying single target and AoE rotations. I think this is an important thing that needs to happen. And finally, for their existing skills, the Queen, Pile Bunker, and Crown Collider just deal AoE damage. I thought of maybe changing their basic attack to be AoE, but then I thought, you know, Bahamut Wormwave doesn't do that, so should the Queen really do that? Yeah, I just said, you know, let's just make Pile Bunker and Crown Collider AoE that way. Again, it's at least part of it. Then if you just overdrived instantly, you know, if you were AoEing a giant pack, you could summon instantly overdrive and you just got a ton of AoE damage. So it just changes up the way you use it and interact with it. Now, I do want to add in some new skills. You know, we condensed a couple things here and a job that already doesn't have a lot of buttons. In fact, I did that deliberately because if this were like a 7.0 rework and I were to add some new skills, yeah, I would add like a railgun, like a massive railgun that you could fire off. And again, I already mentioned getting in the robot, getting in the G-Warrior and going ham during twos or something like that. Of course, Mustadio, you know, his sniper rifle. I guess you could use his sniper rifle and call it a railgun or something like that. Either way, I'm leaving room for them to add things, just things that sound awesome and fun. But for, let's just say 6.x new skills, very, very simple things to add in. One, maintenance. Channeled skill generates heat and battery gauge every few seconds. It's your downtime tool. I think at this point, not having a downtime tool with how frequently they design encounters that have long downtime phases, it just, jobs need it. I mean, I think Reaper needs to have it. I feel like Harvest Moon should grant you, whatever. It should grant you gauge whenever you charge that on Reaper. I just think it's something that's going to become standard. Yes, homogenization, blah, 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 but everyone complains when they don't have it, and then they wish they had it. So if everyone wants it, that's what you're going to get. For the second skill, I wanted to give them one offensive and one defensive utility, but I thought about the defensive utility first, because if you give them enough potency and then you give them an additional defensive utility, again, the former's possible, where they could just be a really high personal damage job, and then they just have less utilities overall. But either way, so for the defensive utility, I felt like I had two options. One, dismantle. Yes, it's a Heavensward skill, I know. But in this case, reduces enemy damage dealt by 5% for 10 seconds. It's basically another, half potency feint or half potency addle. I guess off damage type addle that your ranged roll can bring. And I feel like that's a decent bit different than what the other two range fizz bring also. Bard brings Nature's Min, which again has a few practical applications. They could probably change it and give it even more without, making it any more complicated. Just maybe make it raise max health or something like that. And then you have Dancer, which has Curing Waltz, and it has Improvisation, which is a channeled AoE heal, but more importantly is a max health % shield, which is amazing considering how strong the job is otherwise. So I thought, what do I want to go with for Machinist? And just a flat damage reduction on an opponent with, I don't know, maybe 90-second cooldown or 120-second cooldown, just something extra would just go a really long way to this job being popular in high-end raids. On the other hand, though, I also talked about how I liked the gadgets, and the PvP Bishop turret was definitely an inspiration to do like a pulsing AoE shield, a 100-point shield that stacks every time you get hit, and it pulses 5 times. Then you can lay it down before a big AoE and get a ton of pulses. You can lay it down for tank busters. You can put it down for repeated AoE strikes, so that way you're getting a bunch of little shields, kind of almost working like a Panheima, but the shield's just being applied every few seconds. So that was another consideration, and I kind of like that. You could also just make the Bishop turret dismantle the enemy. I mean, back in Heavensward, your turret would basically apply a trick attack equivalent what Hypercharge was at the time. So you could do it either way. The Bishop turret could just be part of weakening the enemy and making you deal more damage as well, but so be it. I would like to see the Bishop turret return in some way and be utilized in the current kit. And finally, if you just want the boss to take more damage, then Analysis increases enemy damage taken by 10% or 5% is a tough call. 5% for 20 like Trick Attack, or maybe 10% for 10 or 15. I want to go 10% for 15, because again, I look at what the other jobs bring and I go, how can I make this a little bit different? This would only apply to one target, which would make it good for single boss killing, similar to Trick Attack. So Bard and Dancer still have that kind of AoE buffing my allies benefit, and this is a lot more focused on single targets. So it creates a bit of a discrepancy, and of course, eventually people say, make Analysis AoE. Trick Attack's gotten away with being single target, so I think Machinist would be fine with something like Analysis. And honestly, this was just for fun because I like the tool so much. I mentioned liking the Bishop turret and wanting it back in some capacity, whether it be for an AoE shield or to apply that damage reduction or that damage increasing debuff. I want a new trait, the Rook Auto Turret, as a trait instead of as something that the Queen levels up off of. So, at the lower levels, you would now need either to have the Queen at an earlier level, or you would need something other than the Rook Auto Turret, or maybe you make another auto turret for the sake of the skill. Maybe you make it a bit auto turret, like, Ultima has bits, kind of. And essentially, I just wanted it to be that every time heat is used, the Machinist's auto turret activates automatically, and then it'll fire 5 shots, prioritizing the Machinist's current target. I just thought, man, if in the middle of Hypercharge, you've got these rapid fire bullets, you've got these rapid fire shots behind you, you come out of that, you use a tool into the double weaves with your Gauss round and your ricochet. That sounds so fun to me. It's just the rapid fire Machinist. I was like, yo, can I just add a chain gun in on this job at some point? I think we could go nuts with this, but again, I tried to refrain from myself. So that was just a fun little idea I threw on the end there that could be cool, but you know, it is what it is. Now, I did consider some other light changes as well. Nothing too serious. You know, at one point I considered having the heated shots not be just a level up bonus. Barrel stabilizer granting battery was another thing I considered. But at the end of the day, I was like, you know what? The job has very few skills. I feel like I don't need to change absolutely everything the job does. And maybe I should just focus on more of the pain points and just a few fun points that maybe people would like being thrown in. But Machinist needs some help, ladies and gentlemen, and I would like to be the one to give it that. So let me know what you think in the comment section of the video below. I'm sure many of you have your own ideas that you're going to share down there as well. Feel free. And with that, I'm done. So like, favorite, subscribe, and share. You know the drill on YouTube, and I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, take care.